The air in the room felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't the kind of heaviness that came from the London rain or the muted chatter of courtiers pacing the corridors of the palace. This was the kind of silence that carried weight, a suffocating stillness that seemed to choke the oxygen from the air. Prince William stood alone by the window, his hands resting on the cold frame, staring out at the sprawling gardens of Kensington Palace. The lush green lawn stretched out before him, but in his mind's eye, he wasn't looking at a garden. He was replaying the same scene that had haunted him for decades: the flashing lights, the blaring sirens, the twisted wreckage of a black Mercedes in a Paris tunnel, and the lifeless form of the woman who had once been the center of his world. For years, William had been the silent heir, the dutiful son, the man who smiled for photographs and spoke measured words that fit neatly into the public image of the monarchy. He had never given the world reason to believe that behind that carefully curated smile lay a question so dangerous that to voice it aloud could shake the very foundation of the British royal family. But silence, like pressure in a sealed vessel, can only be contained for so long before it ruptures. And now, after years of whispered doubts and unanswered questions, that rupture was here. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The truth, as William saw it, was never the version told in official statements or polished documentaries. It was raw, ugly, and tangled in a web of power, jealousy, and betrayal. It was a truth that no son should have to confront about his own father. To accuse King Charles of ending Princess Diana's life was not a statement William could make lightly. It was a declaration that risked everything: his relationship with his family, his place in the monarchy, his credibility with the public, and perhaps even his safety. But in his mind, the time for protection and politeness was over. If the cost of truth was his crown, then so be it. It had begun as small, almost imperceptible cracks in the official narrative. The night Diana died, William was just 15 years old, yet even at that age, certain details didn't sit right with him. Why had security been so thin that night? Why was his mother traveling without the full royal protection she was accustomed to? Why had certain instructions allegedly been changed at the last minute? Over the years, more pieces of the puzzle would emerge. Hushed conversations with Diana's closest friends, cryptic remarks from members of the household staff, even a few late-night talks with his younger brother Harry, where both admitted they felt something was deeply wrong. The palace had always maintained that the tragedy was nothing more than a horrific accident, a collision fueled by paparazzi pursuit and an intoxicated driver. That was the story fed to the media, repeated endlessly in headlines and memorial broadcasts. And for the public, it was easier to believe, easier to accept that fate, not malice, had taken Diana away. But for William, the more he learned, the harder it became to believe that story. The pieces didn't align. The silences were too strategic. And most damning of all, some of those silences came from inside his own family. One memory stood out above all others. It was a few weeks after Diana's funeral, when the grief was still raw and the palace halls felt like tombs. William had been walking down one of the long corridors when he overheard a conversation between two senior aides. Their voices were hushed, but the words cut through the air like glass. It was necessary for the stability of the crown. At the time, he didn't fully understand what that meant. But as the years went by and the implications sank in, those words would become a stone lodged in his chest, impossible to dislodge, impossible to ignore. In the public eye, William played the role expected of him. He shook hands, smiled for cameras, and honored his mother's memory in speeches that spoke of love and loss without ever hinting at suspicion. But behind closed doors, the doubts only grew. Private letters from his mother, uncovered years later, revealed that Diana herself had feared for her life. In one particularly chilling note, she wrote of a plan to stage a car accident, making it appear as though her death was the result of brake failure. It was a letter that had been quietly dismissed by the palace at the time, but William couldn't dismiss it, not when so much of it mirrored the events of that night. As William grew older and took on more royal responsibilities, he gained access to files and conversations that were previously out of reach. Some of what he found seemed innocuous at first: routine security reports, schedules, correspondence. But within those mundane pages were anomalies. altered timelines, security reroutes, and internal memos that contradicted the official public record. He began to see a pattern, one that pointed not to random tragedy, but to orchestration. The weight of this knowledge wasn't just intellectual. It was deeply personal. For William, this wasn't a matter of politics or palace intrigue. This was about his mother, the woman who had tucked him into bed, who had whispered reassurances when the world felt too heavy, who had walked into landmine fields to help the helpless, and who had been hounded by an institution that never truly embraced her. Every unanswered question felt like a betrayal, not just of Diana's memory, but of justice itself. The final push came in the form of a private conversation with someone who had once worked in Diana's security detail. The man was old now, living far from London, but his voice still carried the weight of loyalty and regret. He told William there had been warnings, explicit ones, about that Paris trip, warnings that were ignored. He claimed decisions made that night were not just negligent, but deliberate. And then he said something that froze William's blood. "Your father knew she wouldn't survive the year." William had walked away from that meeting feeling as though the ground beneath him had shifted forever. For years, he had tried to balance his duty as heir with his duty as a son. But now, he saw them as incompatible. To protect the monarchy was to protect the very institution that had, in his mind, destroyed his mother. And so, the decision was made. He would speak. Not in veiled terms, not in hints or suggestions, but plainly, directly, and without apology. Of course, speaking meant more than just giving an interview. It meant bracing for the tidal wave that would follow, the headlines, the backlash, the palace's inevitable denial, the possibility that some would brand him a traitor to the crown. But William had decided that the truth mattered more than the crown. The truth, as he saw it, belonged to his mother, and it was time the world heard it. He knew the cost. He had seen what happened to those who challenged the establishment. But he also knew that silence would make him complicit. And so he prepared. He gathered what evidence he could, spoke to those who were willing to go on record, and arranged for his words to be broadcast in a way that couldn't be easily buried or spun. He wanted it all on the record, his doubts, his findings, and his belief that his father, King Charles, had played a role in ending the life of Princess Diana. As the day of the revelation approached, the air in the palace grew tense. There were whispers of interventions, of backroom negotiations to keep him quiet. But William stood firm, and when he finally spoke, the world stopped to listen. His words were measured, deliberate, but each one landed like a blow. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He simply told the story as he believed it, letting the weight of his accusation hang in the air for all to hear. That was the moment the monarchy entered uncharted territory. This wasn't a tabloid rumor or an outsider's speculation. This was the future king, standing before the world, accusing the reigning monarch, his own father, of complicity in one of the most shocking royal tragedies of the modern era. And as his final words echoed into the silence, one thing became clear: nothing would ever be the same again. It was the end of August in 1997, and Paris was alive in that particular way only Paris can be. The city's lights shimmered against the Seine, couples wandered hand in hand along the boulevards, and cafes hummed with the low murmur of late-night conversation. But for all its romance, that night carried an undercurrent of chaos. In the Ritz Hotel, Princess Diana prepared for what she thought would be a quiet evening after a day filled with public glances and intrusive lenses. She had been photographed more in the last few weeks than in the past year combined, her every move shadowed by relentless paparazzi. Outside the hotel's grand entrance, photographers were already gathering, waiting for the moment she would step out. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Witnesses later described hushed conversations between members of staff, exchanges of glances that hinted at unease. A security detail, trimmed down from what she might normally expect, was in place, but something about the arrangements felt off. It wasn't the usual meticulous precision that followed her movements. Instead, there were last-minute changes, reroutes, and subtle confusion over which vehicle she would take. Diana had grown accustomed to being hunted by cameras, but she was no stranger to fear. In the months before her death, she had confided in close friends about her unease. She spoke of being watched not just by the press, but by forces much closer to home. There had been unsettling phone calls, cars idling near her Kensington Palace residence, and, most hauntingly, a letter in which she claimed there was a plan to stage her death in a car accident. For many, it was an unsettling paranoia. For her, it was a conviction she couldn't shake. That evening in Paris, she was not alone. Beside her was Dodi Al-Fayed, her companion in those final weeks. He, too, was wary of the circus outside, and together they agreed to take an alternative route to avoid the frenzy. Henri Paul, the Ritz's deputy head of security, was tasked with driving the couple away from the hotel. The decision seemed practical at the time. Slip out through a rear exit, take a different car, and lose the pack of photographers. But it was a decision that would prove fatal. At just after midnight, the black Mercedes pulled away from the Ritz. The streets of Paris were slick with a light drizzle, the city glistening under the street lamps. Almost immediately, the paparazzi caught sight of them. Motorbikes revved, car engines roared, and a high-speed chase began. Diana sat in the back seat, the camera flashes exploding through the tinted glass, turning the inside of the car into a strobe-lit cage. Dodi sat beside her, his hand resting over hers, a silent attempt to reassure her. As they approached the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, events accelerated beyond control. Witnesses spoke of the Mercedes entering the tunnel at dangerous speed, closely pursued by motorcycles. Moments later, the screech of tires echoed in the confined space, followed by a deafening crash. The force crumpled the vehicle's front like paper, trapping its passengers inside. The smell of burning rubber and gasoline filled the air, mingling with the metallic tang of blood. In the aftermath, confusion reigned. Passers-by rushed forward, some to help, others to capture the scene on film. The first emergency calls went out, and within minutes, sirens pierced the night. Yet for reasons that would later be questioned, Diana's removal from the wreckage took an unusually long time. While Dodi and Henri Paul were declared dead at the scene, Diana was still alive, though gravely injured. Emergency responders reported that she was conscious at points, whispering in pain, but the journey to the hospital was slow and circuitous. Official reports cited medical necessity, stabilizing her before moving, but others saw it as an inexplicable delay. By the time she arrived at Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital, the damage was catastrophic. Despite the efforts of surgeons, she was pronounced dead in the early hours of August 31, 1997. The news rippled across the globe, freezing entire nations in shock. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace, laying flowers, lighting candles, and weeping openly in the streets. Television stations abandoned regular programming to run continuous coverage, and newspapers printed in bold black headlines the loss of the people's princess. For the world, the narrative was simple: a tragic accident caused by reckless driving and paparazzi harassment. The official investigation pointed to Henri Paul's intoxication and excessive speed. The British establishment echoed the findings, presenting them as tragic but final. Yet behind palace doors, not everyone was convinced. For William, the phone call that woke him that night was a blur of voices, muffled explanations, and the sharp, cold realization that his life had just been cleaved in two. The image of his mother's smile, the sound of her laugh, the way she would squeeze his hand in reassurance, all of it collided with the incomprehensible truth that she was gone. He felt numb, then hollow, then something else entirely: suspicion. Even at 15, certain details pricked at his mind. Why was she in a car with minimal security? Why was she in Paris at all without the kind of protection afforded to senior royals? And why, when she had openly expressed fears for her life, had those fears not been met with heightened vigilance instead of reduced? The first days after her death were a blur of ceremonies, public appearances, and protocol. William walked behind her coffin, the weight of millions of eyes upon him, yet inside he was drowning. There were condolences from heads of state, whispers from distant relatives, and a wall of silence when he tried to ask direct questions. Everything about the palace in those days felt staged. The grief was real, but the responses felt calculated. Later, he would hear things that deepened his doubts. A photographer who had been at the scene claimed the crash was too sudden, too precise, to be purely accidental. A nurse at the hospital whispered that Diana had been awake when she arrived and had asked to see her sons, something the official record did not mention. Then there was the matter of the surveillance tapes from nearby traffic cameras, some of which were mysteriously missing or malfunctioning during the crucial minutes of the crash. In the years to come, William would return again and again to that night in his mind, trying to piece together a puzzle whose edges seemed deliberately blurred. For him, the story of that night was not just a memory. It was the starting point of a journey that would take him from grief to suspicion, and from suspicion to the dangerous conviction that someone within his own family had a hand in shaping the outcome. The night of August 31st was, for the public, a tragedy that belonged to history. For William, it was the wound that never healed, the night that changed everything, and the moment when his faith in the institution he was born to serve began to fracture. It was the beginning of questions that would eventually lead him to speak words he had once thought unthinkable, that his father, King Charles, had played a role in ending the life of Princess Diana. In the weeks after the funeral, William tried to convince himself that the story everyone was telling must be true. It was easier to believe in tragedy than in betrayal. He clung to the idea that his mother's death had been an accident, a cruel twist of fate that no one could have prevented. But grief has a way of stripping away illusions. The more he replayed the details in his mind, the more he began to feel that something about the official narrative did not fit. It wasn't one glaring flaw that made him doubt. It was the accumulation of small, unsettling pieces that, when put together, painted a darker picture. The first seeds of suspicion were sown almost immediately. In those early days, William was shielded from much of the press coverage. Courtiers ensured that the most sensational headlines and conspiracy theories didn't reach his eyes. But the palace could not control everything, and whispers have a way of seeping through even the thickest walls. He overheard fragments of conversations between aides, snippets from security staff, who spoke in guarded tones. There were words like breach, reroute, and lapse, phrases that felt out of place in a discussion about a random car crash. It was not just what he overheard, but what he did not hear. Certain questions seemed to be avoided entirely. When William asked why his mother's security detail had been reduced that night, he received vague answers about privacy, about how she had been trying to live a more independent life. But he knew his mother. Diana may have craved freedom, but she had also been acutely aware of the threats she faced. She would never have knowingly put herself in a situation where her safety was compromised without reason. One moment in particular stayed with him. A few months after the funeral, William found himself in a quiet drawing room with one of his mother's oldest friends, a woman who had known Diana before she was a princess. She spoke with warmth about Diana's compassion, her humor, her resilience. Most of all, he remembered her insistence that she was being watched, not by strangers, but by people connected to the life she had left behind. It wasn't until William was in his early 20s that he began to actively seek answers. The royal archives were a labyrinth of reports, memos, and official correspondence, and gaining access to them was not easy. But as his position within the family grew, so did his ability to request documents under the guise of preparing for his future role. He told himself he was simply trying to understand the pressures of public life. But in truth, he was searching for any piece of information that might either confirm or put to rest the doubts that had been festering for years. Some of what he found was mundane: itineraries, press schedules, logistical briefings. But hidden among the routine paperwork were inconsistencies. A security report from the night of the crash listed a different departure time than the one given to the French investigators. A briefing memo about her Paris trip had been amended in handwriting he did not recognize, noting a sudden change of driver. And then there were the missing pages, reports that ended abruptly, with references to attachments that were no longer in the file. It was not evidence, at least not in the legal sense. But to William, it was enough to raise more questions. Why were there discrepancies in something as basic as the timeline? Why would certain documents be incomplete? And why, if the tragedy had been nothing more than a tragic accident, did it feel as though someone had gone to great lengths to control the flow of information afterward? He spoke to his brother about it on more than one occasion. Harry was less inclined to believe in deliberate foul play, perhaps because he needed to hold on to some trust in the people around them. But even Harry admitted that certain things didn't add up. They discussed their mother's fears, the letter she had written predicting her own death, and the strange coincidences surrounding the events in Paris. Yet each time the conversation drifted too close to accusing their father, Harry would withdraw, unwilling to say the words aloud. William could not withdraw. The more he thought about it, the more he saw patterns, not just in his mother's death, but in the way her life had been managed in the years before it. The tension between her and Charles had been no secret, nor had the strain her popularity placed on the monarchy. She had been, in many ways, more beloved by the public than the future king himself. For an institution obsessed with stability and control, that was a dangerous imbalance. Friends of Diana told William that she had been planning to make a major announcement in the months after her death, one that would have shaken the monarchy to its core. Some believed it was about her relationship with Dodi Al-Fayed. Others suspected it was about her treatment within the royal family. Whatever it was, she never got the chance to say it. And William could not ignore the possibility that her silence had been ensured in the most permanent way possible. By the time a decade had passed since her death, William's doubts had hardened into something closer to belief. He no longer saw the inconsistencies as random. He saw them as deliberate. The image of his father, walking behind the coffin that day, now carried a different weight. He wondered what thoughts were hidden behind that composed expression, whether there had been any flicker of guilt, or only the cold resolve of a man protecting the institution above all else. These were not the kinds of questions William could ask directly, not then. The monarchy had survived for centuries because it kept its secrets buried deep, and those who dug too far often found themselves isolated. But the first doubts were no longer whispers in the back of his mind. They were a steady, unrelenting voice, one that told him the truth was not what the world believed. And once that voice took hold, it was only a matter of time before it demanded to be heard. In the days following his mother's death, William found himself in a haze of obligations. He stood in front of crowds he could barely see through his grief, his hand clasping Harry's as they followed the coffin. Cameras captured their every movement, their every tear, and the world interpreted their solemn faces as a portrait of royal dignity and tragedy. But behind that stoic mask, William was beginning to notice something that disturbed him far more than the public's gaze: the way his father behaved in those darkest days. To the public, King Charles appeared mournful. He delivered carefully measured words about Diana's place in history, her role as the mother of his children, and the tragedy of her loss. Yet William, who was now old enough to read the subtle language of his father's mannerisms, saw something else entirely. The grief seemed rehearsed, the pauses between words calculated, and the moments of silence less about sorrow and more about control. In private, Charles's composure was almost unsettling. In the first hours after learning of Diana's death, William expected his father to break down, to display at least some vulnerability. Instead, Charles remained upright and reserved, speaking in clipped tones to advisors, his focus fixed on logistics rather than loss. There was a flurry of phone calls, not to family or close friends, but to palace aides, political allies, and media strategists. William could hear fragments of conversations through half-closed doors, phrases like public perception, narrative control, and international sympathy. It was as if his father were preparing for a political crisis rather than mourning the mother of his children. William told himself that perhaps this was just Charles's way of coping, that some people retreat into structure and work in moments of grief. But that explanation began to crumble when he saw how little genuine comfort his father seemed to offer. Harry cried openly in those first few days, his small frame shaking in silent sobs. William, though older, felt the same pull toward despair. Yet when Charles entered the room, his presence was distant, almost clinical. He would place a hand briefly on a shoulder, say something about being strong for the nation, and then retreat again into discussions with advisors. There was one evening, just after the funeral, that William would never forget. He had walked into his father's study, hoping for some moment of connection, perhaps even answers to the questions that were already forming in his mind. Instead, he found Charles at his desk, going through papers with two senior aides. They were discussing arrangements for upcoming public appearances, the management of Diana's estate, and how best to handle the growing public scrutiny. William stood there, waiting for his father to acknowledge him. When Charles finally looked up, his expression was polite but distracted. He asked William if he was ready for school to resume, as though the conversation they should have been having, about loss, about love, about truth, did not matter. Over the weeks that followed, The emotional gap between father and son seemed to widen. William began to notice small but telling reactions. When the subject of Diana arose, Charles would often change the topic quickly. When William mentioned something his mother had told him, Charles's face would tighten, his eyes narrowing just slightly before he replied in a tone that was both dismissive and strained. It wasn't outright hostility, but it was far from warmth. The coldness was not only emotional, it was strategic. William came to understand that within the palace, his father had already moved to redefine Diana's legacy. There were discussions about which of her charitable causes would be maintained and which would be quietly dissolved. Photographs of Diana that once hung in certain palace corridors were removed under the guise of redecorating. Even the official statements released in the weeks after her death seemed to emphasize her flaws, subtly but noticeably, as if to ensure that her image did not overshadow the institution she had often challenged. For William, these decisions felt like betrayals layered upon his grief. His mother had been loved by millions for her compassion and authenticity, and now he watched as that image was carefully edited, the raw truth replaced by something safer, more manageable. And the person guiding this process, the person who should have been protecting Diana's memory for the sake of her sons, was the very man who had once vowed to love her. The distance between them deepened further when William began to ask questions about the night of the crash. His father's responses were consistently brief, often framed in terms of what the official investigations had found. If William pressed further, Charles would end the conversation, either by physically leaving the room or by reminding William that speculation was dangerous for the crown. That word, dangerous, echoed in William's mind. Why would seeking the truth about his mother be considered dangerous, unless there was something to hide? One evening, after yet another failed attempt to discuss the subject, William overheard a conversation between Charles and an aide. The aide was urging Charles to address his son's doubts more directly. Charles's reply was low and deliberate, but the words chilled William to his core. They must learn that not every truth is meant to be spoken. That was the moment William realized his father had no intention of ever giving him the full story. By his late teens, William had learned to mask his own feelings in public, just as his father did. But in private, the lack of emotional support had left a scar. He could not shake the sense that his father's concern was always more for the institution than for his children. And as he grew older, that coldness began to look less like a personal flaw and more like a deliberate strategy, a way to maintain power, control, and secrecy in equal measure. It was during this period that William began to view his father not only as a parent, but also as a political figure, someone capable of calculated moves designed to protect himself and the monarchy. This realization was both clarifying and devastating. It meant that the man he might one day succeed was not simply a flawed human being, but possibly a man whose loyalty to the crown outweighed every other bond, even the bond between father and son. That knowledge would become the fuel for William's determination to uncover what really happened to his mother. The cold distance he felt from his father wasn't just emotional neglect. It was, in William's mind, a signal that there were things his father would never willingly tell him. And if Charles would not share the truth, William would have to find it himself, no matter the cost. By the time William entered his 20s, his life had become a carefully choreographed performance. Every public appearance, every handshake, every smile was mapped out by the palace machine. Yet behind the scenes, there was a world that operated in shadows, a world of whispers, unspoken agreements, and people who knew far more than they would ever say on the record. This was the Whisper Network, a loose web of palace insiders, former staff, journalists, and even certain foreign contacts who seemed to possess pieces of a story that had never been told in full. William had grown up surrounded by palace walls, but adulthood gave him the freedom to move in spaces where those walls didn't always reach. It was in those spaces, quiet dinners with trusted friends, discreet meetings with people who had once worked for his mother, and unexpected encounters during overseas visits, that the whispers began to accumulate. Each one seemed small in isolation, but together they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Some came from people who had been close to Diana during her final years. They spoke cautiously, often glancing over their shoulders or lowering their voices mid-sentence. A former aide described a meeting Diana had with a senior royal in the months before her death. According to this source, the conversation had turned tense when Diana mentioned her fears about being in danger. The royal allegedly told her she was being dramatic and paranoid, but the aide noticed the way his tone shifted, not dismissive, but edged with something that felt like a warning. Then there were the journalists. A handful of seasoned reporters who had covered the royal beat for decades told William, off the record, that certain leads from the Paris crash had been abruptly shut down. One investigative journalist confided that within hours of Diana's death, they received calls from high-level contacts telling them to stop digging into specific angles, particularly anything involving internal royal disputes or private security decisions. The message was clear. The official story was the only story that would be tolerated. William also heard from retired security officers who had once served in royal protection. Some of them were blunt, others more cautious, but all hinted at the same thing. There had been unusual decisions in the weeks leading up to Diana's death. Requests for additional protection had reportedly been denied. Certain security personnel had been reassigned without clear explanation. One former officer claimed that in the hours before the crash, there were changes to the planned routes that seemed unnecessary and risky. Perhaps most unsettling were the whispers from abroad. On a diplomatic trip, William found himself in conversation with a foreign intelligence official who had dealt with British security in the past. Over a private drink, the man leaned in and told William that some foreign agencies had quietly questioned the official account of the crash from the very beginning. They believed there were inconsistencies in the French investigation and had suspicions that certain information was deliberately withheld. Suspicions that, according to the official, had never been pursued publicly because of the potential diplomatic fallout. All of these accounts might have been easier to dismiss if they had come from tabloids or conspiracy theorists. But these were people with credibility, people whose careers had depended on discretion and accuracy. And none of them were eager to speak. They did so reluctantly, often only after William pressed them directly. That reluctance told him as much as the words themselves. It became clear to William that there was an unspoken rule within certain circles. Everyone knew more than they said, and those who knew the most had the most to lose. He began to understand how the palace maintained control, not just over the public narrative, but over the people who might challenge it. Fear was a powerful silencer. Fear of losing a career, of facing legal action, of being socially exiled from the tight-knit world of the British elite. Some conversations were even stranger. On one occasion, William met a man who had once been part of a private security firm contracted for royal events. The man hinted that there had been an off-the-books briefing before Diana's Paris trip. He wouldn't reveal details, only saying, it wasn't about keeping her safe. It was about making sure she stayed contained. When William pressed for clarity, the man refused to elaborate, ending the meeting abruptly and refusing further contact. The more he heard, the more William realized that these whispers, while fragmented, were consistent in one crucial way. They all pointed inward, toward the monarchy itself. None of them blamed only the paparazzi or the driver. Instead, they hinted at decisions made by people in positions of trust and power, decisions that placed Diana in harm's way. The weight of these conversations began to change William's relationship with his role. Publicly, he still played the part expected of him. But privately, he had started keeping mental notes, piecing together what he learned from these encounters. He saw the gaps in the official timeline, the contradictions between different accounts, and the way key witnesses seemed to vanish from public life after speaking out. What made the Whisper Network so powerful was not just the information it carried, but the fact that it was so difficult to confront directly. No one came forward with a single, definitive piece of evidence that could blow the case open. Instead, William was left with 1,000 fragments, each one too small to stand alone, yet together forming a mosaic of suspicion. As the years passed, the whispers didn't fade, they grew louder. Some even hinted that his own father's inner circle had played a role in shaping the events of that night. They didn't always name Charles directly, but they described orders from the top and interests of the crown in ways that left little doubt about where those orders originated. By the time William stepped into his 30s, the Whisper Network was no longer just background noise. It was a force shaping his decisions, his relationships, and his understanding of the institution he would one day inherit. The more he listened, the more convinced he became that the truth had been hidden in plain sight all along, scattered among conversations, buried in archives, and locked away in the memories of people too afraid to speak openly. The moment William decided to confront his father did not come suddenly. It was the result of years of accumulating tension, quiet suspicion, and a growing inability to reconcile the public image of King Charles with the man William saw in private. Each unanswered question, each evasive reply, and each whisper from those who claimed to know more had pushed him closer to the edge. But it wasn't until a private meeting in Clarence House, on an otherwise ordinary evening, that William realized he could no longer keep his doubts to himself. The palace that night was quieter than usual. Official engagements had concluded hours earlier, and most of the staff had retired for the evening. William had asked for a private audience with his father under the pretext of discussing future duties and the increasing scrutiny from the press. Charles agreed, but the tone of his voice suggested he was expecting another routine conversation, not the kind of exchange that would leave both of them changed. When William entered the study, Charles was seated at his desk, reading over a stack of documents. The room smelled faintly of leather and old books, with a fire crackling in the hearth. The familiar scene almost made William hesitate, but the weight of what he carried pressed him forward. He closed the door behind him and remained standing, his eyes fixed on his father. "I need to ask you something," William began, his voice steady but edged with a tension that was impossible to hide. Charles looked up, the expression on his face a mixture of curiosity and mild impatience. William took a breath before speaking again. "It's about Mummy. About Paris. About that night." For a moment, the only sound was the faint pop of the firewood. Charles's gaze hardened, though his posture remained calm. "We've been through this before," he replied evenly. "It was a tragic accident, William. You know that." William didn't move. "I've heard things. From people who were there, from those who knew her. Things that don't fit with what we've been told. I've seen reports that don't match the official story. I've heard about changes to her security, about warnings that were ignored. I need to hear it from you. Did you know she was in danger?" Charles leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. He didn't answer immediately, and the pause felt deliberate. "You're allowing yourself to be influenced by gossip and speculation," he said at last. "You of all people should understand the damage that rumors can do." But William refused to let the conversation end there. He stepped closer, his voice lowering. "This isn't gossip. These are people who worked for her, people who protected her. Some of them are afraid to speak openly. Why would they be afraid if there's nothing to hide? Why would they talk about orders from above? Why would they say you knew she wouldn't survive the year?" The words landed heavily in the room. Charles's face remained controlled, but his fingers tightened slightly on the armrest of his chair. "Be very careful about what you're suggesting," he said quietly. There was no anger in his tone, but there was a warning, a sharp edge that William had heard only a few times in his life, usually when matters of the crown were at stake. "I'm not suggesting," William replied. "I'm asking you directly. Did you have anything to do with Mummy's death?" The question hung between them, charged and irreversible. For a long time, Charles said nothing. His gaze drifted briefly toward the window, as if considering the night outside. When he finally looked back at William, his expression was unreadable. "Everything I have done in my life has been for the protection of this family and the stability of the monarchy," he said. "Sometimes that means making difficult decisions. But I did not end her life." It was a denial, but not the kind William had hoped for. There was no outrage, no wounded insistence on innocence, only a measured statement that left room for interpretation. The words "difficult decisions" lodged in William's mind, echoing with a weight that made his chest tighten. The conversation did not end there. William pressed again, asking about the letter Diana had written predicting her death, about the missing surveillance footage, about the inconsistencies in the timeline. Each time, Charles deflected, offering explanations that sounded rehearsed, each one carefully avoiding absolute certainty. "You're young," he said at one point. "There are things you cannot understand until you've carried the weight I carry." But William was no longer willing to accept that kind of answer. "I don't need to be king to understand when something is wrong," he replied. "And if the truth threatens the monarchy, maybe it's the monarchy that needs to change." That remark drew the first visible flicker of emotion from Charles. His jaw tightened, and for a moment it looked as though he might lash out. But instead, He stood, signaling that the conversation was over. "You have a duty, William," he said, his voice low but firm. "To your family. To your country. Never forget that." William left the study that night with no confession, no smoking gun, but with a deeper conviction than ever that the truth was not in the official story. The coldness in his father's eyes, the way his answers skirted the edges of the question without ever fully addressing it. These were not the reactions of an innocent man, at least not in William's mind. The confrontation had changed something between them. There was now a tension in every interaction, an unspoken awareness that one of them was carrying a question the other would never answer. William knew he couldn't push further, not yet. The monarchy had ways of silencing even its own, and he needed time, allies, and proof before he could take the next step. But as he walked out into the cool night air, one thought crystallized in his mind. The truth would not come from his father's lips. He would have to find it elsewhere. The decision to seek the truth outside of his father's words meant William had to tread carefully. The palace was a fortress of information, its archives guarded not only by locks and keys, but by an unspoken code of loyalty. Inside those walls lay decades of records, security logs, travel schedules, internal memos, and private correspondence. Each file a fragment of history, each potentially holding answers that had been deliberately kept from public view. William understood that if anything existed to confirm his suspicions, it would be buried in those files. His opportunity came gradually. Over the years, as his role in the royal family grew, so did his access. Preparing for state visits, overseeing charitable initiatives, and being briefed on historical matters all required him to review documents, some of which were classified far beyond what the public could ever see. Most of the time, these papers were tedious, outdated speeches, ceremonial records, letters of gratitude from foreign dignitaries. But occasionally, a document would appear that hinted at deeper, more sensitive matters, and William began to notice patterns. He realized that files related to his mother often appeared in fragmented form. Official reports from her overseas trips would be complete and neatly archived, except for the ones leading up to her death. Those were often missing attachments, had entire sections blacked out, or were marked as restricted, royal security only. In one instance, he came across a briefing for a visit Diana made to Paris in 1995. It was thorough, listing every security measure, contact point, and backup plan. When he compared it to the briefing from the week she died in 1997, the difference was stark. The latter was shorter, less detailed, and lacked the secondary safety measures that had been standard in earlier years. That difference gnawed at him. Why would the level of protection decrease over time, especially given that Diana was still a high-profile target for paparazzi and potentially even political adversaries? The omission wasn't just careless, it looked deliberate. His search deepened when he began quietly asking members of the royal staff about where certain historical files were stored. One archivist, an older man who had worked at the palace for decades, told him that sensitive documents were often kept in an off-site facility, one that only the highest-ranking officials could access. William knew pressing the man too hard could arouse suspicion, so he kept the conversation casual, but it planted a seed. If there was an off-site repository, that was where the answers might be. Months later, an official pretext allowed him to visit that location. As part of a review of historical royal protocols, he was granted supervised access to a secure archive in the countryside. The building looked unremarkable from the outside, but inside it was climate-controlled and lined with rows upon rows of shelves, each holding meticulously labeled boxes. The air smelled faintly of paper and dust, the silence so complete that even the faint rustle of turning pages seemed loud. With an aide present, William knew he couldn't openly search for incriminating documents, but he could observe. He noted that boxes related to his mother's travels were stored in a separate section, marked with red tags indicating their restricted nature. More than once, he asked casually about reviewing these, only to be told that they were pending review or not relevant to the current purpose. The refusal was polite, but firm, and that firmness told him he was on the right path. Later, he found a way to get closer. During preparations for a major royal anniversary, a large batch of documents was brought back from storage for review. Among them, he spotted a folder labeled Security Brief, Paris, August 30th, 97. His pulse quickened. When he opened it, he found a short, typed summary outlining the evening's planned movements. But there were inconsistencies. The route listed was not the one officially reported after the crash. There was also a handwritten note in the margin that read, "Confirmed by CP. No need for secondary vehicle." The initials CP matched those of a senior palace official who had been close to Charles. The more he looked, the more questions arose. Why eliminate a secondary vehicle, a standard precaution? Why was there no mention of a contingency plan in case of press pursuit, something Diana had faced countless times before? And why did the report seem almost designed to look innocuous, as if it had been rewritten after the fact? His investigation began to attract subtle resistance. Documents he requested took longer to arrive. Certain meetings were scheduled over times he had intended to spend in the archives. A trusted staff member quietly warned him that his interest in the 1997 files was being noticed. "Be careful," she told him in a low voice one evening. "There are things you're better off not knowing." But William could no longer turn back. In a locked drawer of his own desk, he began compiling copies and notes. Nothing that could be traced back to a specific missing file, but enough to build a timeline. That timeline suggested that multiple changes to Diana's security had been made in the days before her death, and that those changes had been authorized by individuals who answered directly to the highest level of the monarchy. The implications were chilling. It wasn't proof in a legal sense, but it was the strongest indication yet that the events of that night had been influenced, perhaps even orchestrated, from within. Holding the papers in his hands, William felt a mixture of vindication and dread. He was closer to the truth than ever, but every step forward also brought him closer to a line that, once crossed, could not be uncrossed. Through much of his search for the truth, William had kept his brother at arm's length. It wasn't out of distrust, but out of caution. Harry had always been more open with his emotions, more willing to speak without filtering his words, and William feared that involving him too soon might draw the wrong kind of attention. But no matter how careful William was, there came a point when the weight of what he had uncovered pressed too heavily to carry alone. He needed to know where Harry stood and whether his younger brother would be prepared to face the same possibility. That their father had not only failed to protect their mother, but might have been involved in her death. Their first real conversation on the matter took place at Highgrove, away from the constant presence of Palisades. They sat in the garden on a gray autumn afternoon, mugs of tea cooling in their hands, the damp smell of fallen leaves hanging in the air. William began slowly, asking Harry whether he ever thought about the crash, whether there were questions that still troubled him. Harry didn't hesitate. "All the time," he admitted. "There are things I've never been able to make sense of. But every time I try to ask, they shut me down." That admission opened the door, and William stepped through it. He spoke carefully, laying out some of the inconsistencies he had found, the changes to security, the missing files, the whispers from people who had been close to Diana. Harry listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from curiosity to unease. When William finished, there was a long silence. "You're saying you think someone inside?" Harry's voice was low, almost reluctant. "I'm saying I think this wasn't just bad luck or bad timing," William replied. "I think there were decisions made that night, and before, that made her death almost inevitable. And those decisions came from high up." Harry looked away, his gaze fixed on the bare branches of a nearby tree. "You mean him?" he said finally, though he didn't say the name. William didn't answer directly, but the pause was enough. Harry exhaled sharply and rubbed his face with both hands. "If that's true," he began, then trailed off, as if the thought was too heavy to finish. In the days that followed, they spoke more, sometimes in person, sometimes over the phone during Harry's military postings. At first, Harry seemed willing to explore the idea that the official story was incomplete. He brought up his own memories. The rushed explanations, the strange avoidance of certain topics, the sense that some people were more concerned with controlling the narrative than with comforting two grieving boys. He mentioned an offhand remark from a former security officer who had once told him, "Your mom knew too much for her own good." But Harry's willingness to entertain the possibility of foul play was tempered by something else: fear. He worried about what would happen if they pushed too hard, if they accused their father without undeniable proof. "They'd tear us apart in the press," he told William more than once. "They'd make us look like we've lost our minds." and they'd find a way to make sure no one believed a word we said. That fear wasn't unfounded. They both knew how ruthlessly the monarchy could protect itself, and how the media could be weaponized to discredit anyone who threatened the institution. William understood Harry's caution, but he also knew that waiting for perfect evidence might mean waiting forever. Their conversations grew more tense as William's determination clashed with Harry's hesitation. At one point, Harry accused William of letting his anger cloud his judgment. William shot back that Harry was letting loyalty to their father blind him to the truth. It was the kind of exchange that left them both silent for days afterward. Yet, even in disagreement, there was a shared understanding between them, an unspoken recognition that something about their mother's death had never been fully explained. Harry admitted that he sometimes dreamed about confronting their father, demanding answers in front of the whole family, but each time he woke up with the same thought: it would destroy what little stability they had left. There was also the question of what Diana herself would have wanted. Harry argued that she wouldn't have wanted her sons to become enemies of their own blood, to tear apart the monarchy in pursuit of vengeance. William countered that she would have wanted the truth, no matter the cost. This difference in interpretation became another fault line between them. Still, there were moments when Harry seemed to edge closer to William's side. Once, after a long evening spent reminiscing about their childhood, Harry said quietly, "If you ever decide to go public, I won't stop you. I might not join you, but I won't stand in your way." It wasn't the support William hoped for, but it was a kind of permission, a tacit acknowledgement that if the moment came, Harry would not betray him. The complexity of Harry's position became clear over time. He was torn between two truths, the one his instincts told him, and the one the institution demanded he uphold. He could not yet bring himself to take the leap William was preparing for, but neither could he fully dismiss his brother's suspicions. In the end, Harry's stance was less about denial and more about survival. He knew the risks. He had seen what happened to those who crossed the monarchy, and for now, he chose to stand just close enough to the fire to feel its heat, but not so close that it could burn him. For William, that wasn't enough. He needed more than quiet understanding. He needed action. But he also knew that forcing Harry into his fight would only fracture them further. So he made a choice, to continue his search largely on his own, knowing that when the time came, he might have to stand before the world and speak the truth without his brother at his side. For William, the path toward understanding his mother's death could not be separated from the woman who had, in his eyes, been at the center of much of Diana's pain while alive. Camilla had been a constant presence in the shadows of his parents' marriage, a figure who went from whispered scandal to accepted reality within the royal family. William had learned to tolerate her for the sake of appearances, but that tolerance was built on necessity, not warmth. As his investigation deepened, and whispers began pointing not just toward his father but toward those around him, William began to consider the possibility that Camilla's role in the events leading to Diana's death might have been more than passive. Camilla's public image had transformed over the years, carefully managed by palace public relations. She had gone from being portrayed as the homewrecker to the woman who had won over the public with her charm and dedication to Charles. But behind closed doors, William sensed her influence in subtle ways. It wasn't always direct. Sometimes it was a quiet word to an aide, a suggestion framed as concern, or a comment that seemed casual but carried the weight of shaping decisions. William could recall moments from his teenage years when Camilla's presence felt intrusive. There were family gatherings where she seemed to steer conversations away from Diana's memory, subtly redirecting attention toward the stability of the present royal household. At public events, she rarely acknowledged Diana's legacy, even when charity representatives or well-wishers mentioned it. Over time, William began to see this not just as personal discomfort, but as part of a deliberate effort to minimize his mother's lingering hold over public affection. The deeper William looked into the weeks and months before Diana's death, the more he found indications that Camilla had been increasingly close to the decision-making core of the monarchy. Her relationship with Charles had reached a point where she was no longer just a private companion. She was an advisor of sorts, influencing the tone and direction of his responses to both public and private matters. It was during this period that certain choices regarding Diana's security and public engagements began to shift. One source, a former staff member who had since retired abroad, told William in a hushed voice that there had been a meeting in the summer of 1997 where Camilla was present alongside Charles and several senior aides. The purpose of the meeting was officially to discuss upcoming events and media strategies, but according to this source, the conversation turned toward Diana's growing independence and her relationship with Dodi Al-Fayed. There was concern, not just personal jealousy, but the potential political ramifications of Diana aligning herself with someone outside the British establishment. The source recalled Camilla saying something to the effect of, "It's time this circus ended, once and for all." The words could be interpreted in many ways, but in the context of what followed, they took on a sinister weight for William. There were also more personal observations that troubled him. During a dinner at Clarence House years after Diana's death, William noticed how Camilla reacted when someone at the table mentioned his mother's humanitarian work. Camilla's smile tightened, and she quickly diverted the conversation to a different topic. It wasn't anger or grief in her expression. It was something colder, like a refusal to let Diana's name linger in the room. The tension between William and Camilla was never open warfare, but it simmered beneath the surface. In public, he was polite. In private, he kept his distance. As he pieced together his timeline of events leading to Paris, he began marking the moments where Camilla's influence intersected with key decisions about Diana. Each mark deepened his suspicion that she had not merely been a bystander to history. It wasn't just about jealousy or rivalry. Camilla's position in the royal family was precarious in the years before Diana's death. While she had Charles's devotion, she did not yet have the full acceptance of the monarchy or the public. Diana's enduring popularity was a constant obstacle to Camilla's integration into royal life. Removing Diana from the equation, even indirectly, would have removed the largest barrier between Camilla and the life she ultimately stepped into. William wrestled with this idea, aware of how dangerous it was to attribute intent without irrefutable proof. But the whispers he heard, the testimonies from those who had worked close to both women, and the strange timing of certain events all formed a picture that was hard to ignore. The reduction in Diana's security, the changes to her travel plans, and the heightened monitoring of her movements. All of these developments had occurred during a time when Camilla's voice in royal matters was stronger than ever. He could not say for certain whether Camilla had been directly involved in any decisions about Diana's safety, but he could not dismiss the possibility that her presence and her interests had played a role in shaping the environment in which those decisions were made. And for William, that was enough to consider her part of the larger web he was untangling. As he looked at the life Camilla now lived, the titles, the acceptance, the public appearances beside his father, William couldn't help but think about the cost of her ascent. His mother was gone, her legacy reshaped, and the woman who had once been the silent rival now stood at the heart of the monarchy. Whether by design or by circumstance, Camilla had gained everything Diana had lost. And for William, that fact was another piece of the puzzle he could not put down. The breaking point did not arrive with a single revelation or a dramatic piece of evidence. It came slowly, the way water wears down stone, small moments of clarity building until the weight of them could no longer be ignored. William had spent years quietly gathering pieces of a story that no one in the monarchy wanted told. He had listened to whispers, tracked down retired staff, sifted through partial files, and confronted the people at the center of his suspicions. Each time he thought he might find peace in the answers, he was met with more evasions, more contradictions, and more subtle warnings to stop. The moment that finally pushed him past the point of silence began in an unexpected setting. It was a private reception at a foreign embassy, a place where conversations often flowed more freely away from British soil. A senior diplomat, perhaps emboldened by the informal atmosphere, pulled William aside. Speaking in careful, measured words, the man said, "There are things your family never wanted the world to know about that night in Paris. You should be careful where you look, and who you tell when you find it." The man offered no further detail, but the tone was enough. It was confirmation that his suspicions were not simply the result of grief or paranoia. Others knew. By then, William had already noticed how his efforts to dig deeper were being quietly hindered. Requests for certain records were denied with vague justifications. People he had been in contact with began to avoid him, some abruptly ending their willingness to speak. In a few cases, sources who had been open with him suddenly retracted their statements, claiming they had misremembered events. It was as if a silent hand was sweeping through his investigation, erasing traces before he could follow them to the end. One night at Kensington Palace, sitting alone in his study, William laid out his notes. The timeline of events in the weeks before Diana's death now spanned across his desk. Security changes, last-minute travel adjustments, withheld intelligence warnings, and the movements of key figures within the royal household. There was no single piece of irrefutable proof, but together the patterns were impossible to ignore. Every path pointed back toward decisions made at the highest level of the monarchy, and every decision seemed to tilt the odds toward the inevitability of Diana's death. He knew the risk of speaking openly about what he had found. The monarchy was built on control. Control of image, control of information, control of narrative. Any public suggestion that the crown had been complicit in the death of the most beloved woman in modern royal history would be seen as an attack on the very foundation of the institution. And in that battle, the monarchy's resources were vast, its willingness to protect itself absolute. The internal pressure was growing as well. In subtle ways, his father's circle made it clear that his questions had not gone unnoticed. A senior aide once told him during a casual conversation, "Sometimes the stability of the crown depends on letting certain things rest." The statement was delivered as advice, but William heard the warning beneath it. What made the decision to break his silence inevitable was not just the accumulation of evidence, but the realization that remaining silent would make him complicit. His mother's memory had already been reshaped, her story retold in ways that sanitized the conflicts and erased the threats she had faced. If he did nothing, that version of events, the one the monarchy had approved, would become the only truth left standing. The breaking point crystallized one evening during a private family gathering. It was meant to be a rare moment of unity, with relatives gathered in one of the palace's grand dining rooms. Over the course of the evening, a conversation turned briefly to the anniversary of Diana's death. There were polite remarks, carefully worded acknowledgments of her charity work, but nothing of real substance. Then Camilla, with a faint smile, remarked that it was time to focus on the future, not dwell on the past. To anyone else, it might have sounded like a harmless statement. To William, it was a trigger. The past she spoke of was his mother's life and death, a history he was still fighting to understand. The ease with which she dismissed it, in a room full of people who knew the truth was far from complete, was the final reminder that there would never be a right moment to speak. Waiting for permission was pointless. The only choice was to act. That night, William returned to Kensington Palace and sat at his desk until the early hours of the morning. He began drafting a statement, not a formal address, but a raw account of his doubts, his discoveries, and his conviction that the official version of events was incomplete. It was not yet a declaration he would make public, but it was the first time he allowed himself to put his thoughts into words without filtering them for political safety. As he wrote, he felt the weight of years lifting, replaced by the clarity of knowing there was no turning back. By the time dawn broke, he had made his decision. He would speak, not to palace officials, not in the privacy of family rooms, but to the world. The truth, as he saw it, belonged to the public as much as it belonged to him. It was his mother's story, and he would not let it be buried in the quiet corridors of royal secrecy. The breaking point had come, and it had left no room for retreat.